Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to this first afternoon session on metaphysics, particularly the Actus essendi. My name is Father Matthew Gummess. I'm visiting faculty here in the program of Liberal Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome our three speakers for our afternoon's conversation. I'll introduce each of them before they give their presentation. So we'll begin with Renato José Jim Moraes, who serves as the Dean of the Institute of Philosophy and Theology at the Faculdade Atlântico in Rio de Janeiro. His research focuses on metaphysics and the philosophy of nature. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and the title of his presentation is The Actus essendi in Thomas Aquinas, from Gilson to Dewan and beyond. So let's welcome Dr. G. Moraes.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'm going to speak now about the Actus essendi in Thomas Aquinas. Well, as I think it happens with everyone, we have many, the papers are much longer than the presentation we're going to make, but I think that I can speak to you the essential points for me. Well, Gilson's conception, that the core of Aquinas' metaphysics consists in the notion of the act of being, deserves special attention for its general impact and novelty. Gilson considered that he was recovering Aquinas' authentic thought, which had been misunderstood for centuries. Gilson's expositions on metaphysics were often united with his peculiar view of Christian philosophy and the relationship between reason and faith. For Gilson, Christian philosophy arises within theology and cannot be separated from it, and it is necessarily influenced by the faith of the Christian who philosophizes. Lawrence Dewan, contrarily, has different views from Gilson on many subjects, especially about the role of form and ess in the composition of beings and the notion of act of being. In this paper, I will try to compare these conceptions and understand them better, which one is more faithful to Thomas Aquinas. So to analyze Gilson's position first, I'm going to see 3 points. First, the act of being as the core element of Thomas Aquinas' metaphysics. 2, the distinction between the act of being, essence and form. 3, the originality of Thomas Aquinas' philosophy. All these points, they can be synthesized in a passage from Gilson himself. I ask you to forgive my English, I was coming here and a person said, well, you are Brazilian, you are hopeless, you can say, okay, let's do what I can. I hope you can understand me, sorry. But the test by Gilson that I was telling is this one. It has often been said that Thomas' metaphysics, and consequently his whole philosophy, is dominated by his notion of reality and being. This is perfectly true. Perhaps we should go even further to say that this notion puts in question the very existence of a philosophy that is Thomas' own. Failing to have understood its originality and depth, excellent historians thought they could say that Thomas did nothing but repeat Aristotle. So that's the idea, the core point, the act of being, and because of that, Thomas Aquinas is original. Now, to start about the act of being, according to Gilson, he replaces the emphasis on the act of being based on the notion that God is absolutely simple, whose essence is his own being, ipsum esse. Então, Thomas Aquinas often writes that God is subsistent being itself. There's a text of the Summa Theology that Gilson many times refers to it. Well, for sure, it's a very famous text of Thomas Aquinas, and that's in part 1, question 4, article 1 of the Summa. Aquinas writes, being itself is the most perfect of all things, Indeed, it's compared to all of them as act, for nothing has actuality except insofar as it is. Hence, being itself is the actuality of all things, and even of the forms themselves. Hence, it's not compared to other things, as the recipient to the received, but rather as the received to the recipient. For when I say the being of man, or of horse, or of any other thing, being itself is considered as formal and received, but not as that to which it belongs to be. God is subsistent being itself, and so being is the most important thing. And Gilson, he came to that conclusion. He thinks that Aquinas went to that conclusion because his exegesis of the Exodus, when God says about himself, I am who I am. That's the point, that for Gilson, there is a theological foundation in the Christian philosophy. As being so important, the central notion, the second step is the distinction between act of being and essence, infinite beings. If being is the act, essence will have the function of potency. Form is a cause that determines the essence of the being. Form needs being to become actual and real. That's Gilson's views. Gilson, as I said, believes that Aquinas derived this real distinction theologically from the Bible. And for him, for Gilson, the Thomistic tradition, this differentiation is the central point. Someone will be a Thomist or won't be a real Thomist, a faithful Thomist, if he understands being as the core of metaphysics. And in fact, Gilson is very rigorous with his predecessors, Thomas de Ville, Capriolus. He does not think that they are, in fact, Thomists. According to Gilson, always from his interpretation of Aquinas, form causes being because it's the constitutive cause of substance, which is what exists. Substance exists, and form is part of the essence of substance. Being is not an act of being, is not a thing in itself distinct from essence, as if it were another thing. But the composition of both is what makes a thing appear. There's the problem that you know better than me. Being, the sense of being. It can be ens, the subject, or the verb, the act to be. Even Gilson, in French, he has some problems with the translation. But here there's an important text, from Gilson, when he writes, when you reach the question, what's God? The time has come for our intellect to cast off its moorings and to set sail on the infinite ocean of pure esse, or act, whereby that which is actually is. And he say that God, that's his idea. He used it's called the via remotionis. You take everything from God that's not God himself. The last thing that you splits from God is essence. So for him, that's an important expression. At that moment, the theologian is not beyond being. On the contrary, he is beyond the essence, at the very core of being. For Gilson, to affirm that God is only being, it is to deny in him everything that, by being a determination of being, is its negation. That I think it's an important idea. Everything that's a determination of being will be a negation of being for Gilson. According to him, Aristotle's thought reaches the plane of substance, while Thomas Aquinas revealed another plane, that of the existential act. I don't like the expression existential, but that's how Gilson uses it. I won't dive into it, no? But the idea that existence is the act of being, no? The actus essendi. Now Dewan. Now we'll go to Dewan. Dewan sought to demonstrate that Gilson's view of the notion of S is mistaken in three aspects. First, in trying to bring Thomas Aquinas to the side of those who say that God has no essence. The test that I read, I think that it's a strong one. No? Second, in the misunderstanding of the causality that Thomas attributes to S and to form. So let's try to see it. No, Gilson, he says, no, that according to Dewan, that Thomas Aquinas, his doctrine, went in the direction to deny that God has an essence. Gilson, to be fair, he writes that Thomas Aquinas never said that God has no essence, but he thinks that there would be no problem if he had said that. No, he could have said that. But Dewan, on the contrary, he thinks, no, that the real doctrine of Aquinas, for him, essence is found in God more truly than in other beings. It's the contrary, no? And the passage in which Dewan bases himself is a text from the Actus essendi that is, but because being ends is said absolutely and primarily of substances and posteriorly and in a somewhat qualified sense of accidents, this it is that essence also properly and truly is in substances, but in accidents it is in a certain measure and in a qualified sense. But of substances, some are simple and some are composite, and in both there is essence, but in the simple in a truer and more noble degree, inasmuch as they also have more noble being, for they are the cause of those which are composite, at least the first simple substance, which is God. So the truer the substance, the truer the being, not the opposite. It's not that when you have more S, your form or your essence would be smaller. The contrary. No, more S, it's more essence, more substance. Thomas Aquinas, he states unequivocally that God is by essence his form, for instance, and that he is identical to his essence or nature, and ultimately that he is not only his essence, but also his being. No? Consequently, for Dewan, denying an essence in God will be tantamount to eliminating God himself. And there's a test that Dewan used that for him is very important from the Summa contra Gentiles that says, and though these two in God are most truly one, yet in God there is whatever pertains to his subsistence, essence, or esse. For it befits him not to be another, inasmuch as he is subsistent. To be something, esse quid, inasmuch as he is an essence. And to be enacted by reason of his own being, ipsius esse. So you see, I think it's clear, no, the different interpretations about that, no? And according to Dewan, Gilson maintains that God is only esse and not essence, which distorts Thomas' position, for whom God is esse, not the only essence. God is, well, in fact, his esse is his essence, but even better, his essence is his act of being. Gilson, always according to Dewan, considers S as something different. This part is difficult to understand. I reread in Dewan, and I think it's problematic how he explains, but I'm trying to paraphrase. Dewan has a very important article on Gilson. He published it in 1999. And the most important difference are there explicit. But Dewan says, no, that Gilson considers esse, Actus essendi, something different from the actual existence of essence, and identifies essence with its own actual existence. Well, esse different from the actual existence of essence, and for Gilson, essence is its own actual existence, always according to Dewan. The correct doctrine for Dewan is that the actually existent essence is different from its own existence. Gilson, on the contrary, argues that if esse means the actual existence of essence, it can only be identical to essence. The being of actual existence results from the composition between an essence and its act of being, without a third element to be added. That's Gilson. Dewan says that he agrees that there's not a third element, but important, esse is nothing more than the actual existence of essence. For Dewan, that's the right position. Gilson seems to understand that esse, which he calls an act, preferably to state, that's an important differentiation. S as act, S as state. Gilson defends that according to Dewan, this difference between act and state, S as an act constitutes or establish essence in a state of actual existence, a state indistinguishable from essence itself. I'm going to try to explain how I understand all these ideas. For Dewan, essence, the esse is essence existing, only that, no? And in his other writings, that become even clearer. Esse becomes almost, he differentiates from essence, but he maintains esse becomes almost part of essence. That's what happens. And there is the third thing that Gilson says is the esse of the composite, the esse of the substance. So you would have an esse for the essence and a second esse for the substance. No? And this esse as a principle, the Actus essendi, would be the esse with the essence, the esse with the essence before the composite. That's the idea. No? And the final moment when the substance is complete is when the form gives the esse to the composite. And that's an idea that's important because, in fact, it's based on Thomas. Forma gives the Actus essendi. Form gives the Actus essendi. No? Is it too much complicated? Well, Dewan, that's important. I think it's important to put him in history. No, he uses, for instance, Capriolos as a basis for his idea. And in the text of Capriolos, Capriolos writes, esse does not imprint on essence any reality. Esse does not imprint essence any reality, nor does it communicate to essence its own reality, but rather esse is the act and the reality of essence. Esse does not bring anything, but is the act of essence. Essence is the important thing, okay? Well, I need to finish, Father, So, what's my idea, Dewan criticized the distinction proposed by Gilson, as I said, of two senses of existence, state and act, and he thinks it's a confusion. In my conclusion about these two positions that are very different, Despite Dewan's remarkable mastery of Thomas Aquinas' texts, and it's impressive, Dewan is excellent, to say the least. I believe that Gilson is correct to state that potency should not be, that the Actus essendi is the core. But I think that Dewan has a point and something that's a problem in Gilson, and that I see in many Thomists nowadays, to understand potency as something negative, like a limitation. In fact, Thomas Aquinas, he says that essence determines the being, but he never says that's something negative, as Gilson tends to say. No, so there are some texts in which, when St. Thomas is writing about God, in fact, he says that God has no limitation, he has no potence at all, so he is perfect being, ipsum esse subsistens. And in fact, a potency in God, I think it will be something negative, a determination. And God has no determination. God in is ipsum esse subsistens. But for finite beings, potency is not a limitation. It's a possibility. You can only have the act through potency. So we can only have our act of being through essence. In the sense, form is cause essendi. It's a formal cause. It's how the being will be, through form. And form determines it. But form itself can only be through Actus essendi. And in this point, I think Gilson is right. So I think Gilson exaggerates. There are other points that I believe Dewan is right. Dewan says that the distinction between ess and essence can be philosophically proved. Gilson says that in fact, you only get to it through a theological way. You want to get it philosophically, directly. No? So I think that's the idea. Those are my conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. G. Moraes. And we have some time for questions.
Father Philip has a very good article about Dewan, and Joseph Owens, So I mean, it's worth reading.
So one thing that I'm sure you talked about it in the paper, but it didn't come up in the presentation, that strikes me as especially important given your comments at the very end, is the way that Dewan conceives of form and thinks that Aquinas conceives of form as precisely as virtus essendi, right?
Exactly.
So, as something akin to not just kind of a potentiality,
yes,
but something akin to an active potency,
yes,
for esse, and the way that for Dewan means that esse now so Actus essendi reconceived as kind of the quasi-proper operation,
okay,
of form, actually then for Dewan makes esse final cause. So
yes,
in a weird way, in Dewanian metaphysics, esse is actually more exalted than in Gilsonian metaphysics. The final cause is the cause of cause.
Yes. These tests from Dewan, they are very interesting. They're in his book, and he says exactly what Father Philip Neri has stated. That esse would be the final cause of being. But in fact, Father, there are other texts of Dewan when he says that esse does not give anything to being, and being esse is not participate. No, is participate. I don't remember his expression, but even when he says that, I believe that his whole vision, his whole conception, esse becomes smaller than should be. I think that's what you said. I think it's interesting that, in fact, form cannot be seen as something negative. in fact, it's a virtue. It's something that, it's a possibility, more than a negation. And in this, I think Dewan is right. But I don't know if he went too far when he started to discuss with Gilson. Gilson is similar, but not totally with Joseph Owens that you have criticized. No, there are some similarities. Gilson went too far also. And I think that Gilson is not fair when he judges his predecessors. I think he exaggerates, in all that. But I think that even if Dewan understands that S is the final cause, I think it's final in a certain sense, yes, because the perfection is being, the Actus essendi. It's true. But S is in the beginning also. Form can be through the Actus essendi. She will determine how the Actus essendi will be. But she is through it. I don't know if it's, that's my idea, my interpretation. I know, if I can, I will talk to Professor Ruud Stevelde after, because I know I didn't read your book yet, Professor. I have it in my computer also, but I didn't write it totally. But I know that you think in a way different, I imagine. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not always sure what I think about it.
No, it's not easy. For me,
I think Dewan is right in emphasizing the idea that form is principle of being, principle of being.
Yes, that's important.
Thing.
Yes.
So there's no form without being, there's no being without form.
Yes, that's important. Yeah.
So the matter receives the form, and with the form, the composite form of matter has a certain being.
Yes. No, it's interesting because I mistake that I think that happens, and maybe Capriolo.
I think, excuse me, one remark.
Yes.
The fault of Gilson is he knows, of course, those texts. You read it differently. He said, form is being. Forma dat esse.
Dat esse.
Form is being. Yes, said Gilson. Only formal being.
Yes, that's what he says.
Oh, only formal being. That is not enough. So the existential being must be added to it from an efficient cause.
Oh, yes, that's important.
And I think that is not correct.
That's not correct. And there's what you said is important, and I didn't spoke here, but it's very important. Neither form, neither Actus essendi are a thing before they are together. What really exists, what really is being, is substance, an actual substance. Sometimes when you read the texts, the commentators, they reify, I would say, or the form or being, and that's not correct. So, in fact, Actus essendi only exists with form and form with Actus essendi in the finite beings. In the case of God, also I would like to stress that to say that God has no essence, I don't think that you can do it according to Thomas Aquinas. No, but the essence of God is his act of being. And what Professor Ruud said, there is a point that I think that I would like to say too, that form is causa essendi, formally, but there is only a being if there is a form, for sure. But form does not have S by itself. If it had, should necessarily exist. Being would be part of its essence, and only in God, being is part of essence. If not, it would be God. No, God is the only absolutely necessary being. No, all the finite beings are not necessary. So they receive the S from outside, through form. Maybe I'm not as I don't think like Professor Wood, but I need to read your book and I'll write to you.
I'm sorry,
We need to stop, no?
Yeah, with respect to our next
We can talk.
speakers, but
Thank you very much.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to a PhD student here at Notre Dame, Father Christian Ivandic, who is a German priest of the Congregation of the Legionaries of Christ, studying systematic theology here. The title of his presentation is Thomas Aquinas and the Real Distinction, Arguments Based on the Limited Character of Being in Individual Entities. Let's welcome Father Christian.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming. This certainly will be more in line of a Gilsonian interpretation to some extent, or maybe also Cornelio Fabro. So let's see later for your questions too. Okay, so for Thomas Aquinas, every finite substance, whether material or spiritual, is metaphysically composed of two really distinct principles, being, esse, and essence, essentia. Scholars like John Whipple have shown the originality of the thesis of the real distinction and its regulating function for the entire corpus Thomisticum. In other words, it differs substantially from, for example, the equally influential metaphysical doctrines of Duns Scotus or Francisco Suarez, and plays a decisive role in not only Thomas's specifically metaphysical thought, but also his whole philosophical and theological oeuvre. In this paper, I will analyze one of the arguments Thomas Aquinas develops for the real distinction of being and essence, and show how it depends on Thomas's particular conception of being as the source of all actuality and all perfection. In doing so, I will contrast Aquinas' conception of being to the readings of other thinkers such as John of St. Thomas and Thomas Thynn, who reduce being to the act of existence of an already formally determined essence. So Whipple has distinguished in the Corpus Thomisticum 5 types of arguments for the real distinction. This paper analyzes the last type of argumentation, that is to say, the arguments for the real distinction of being and essence based on the limited character of being in individual entities. There are two main reasons for this. First, this type of Thomistic argument for the real distinction remains, despite its mixed acceptance, the least analyzed one in scholarly literature, which has mostly focused on the intellectus essentia argument found in Aquinas' De Ente et Essentia. Second, I hold that this type of argument for the real distinction elucidates very well Thomas's particular conception of being as such. In other words, this argument for the real distinction based on the non-self-limiting quality of being is only comprehensible if we understand what Thomas means by being as such, esse. However, if we do understand Aquinas' conception of being, then this argument is one of the most powerful philosophical arguments for the real distinction of being and essence. Whipple notes that although the fifth type of argumentation is rarely found in the Corpus Thomisticum as a formal argument for the real distinction, it does incorporate principles that Aquinas uses very frequently throughout his oeuvre. One passage where he formally uses this type of argumentation is found in his commentary to the sentences. And there's a handout, this should be text 1. And I have given the respective English translations to the text underneath. So Thomas writes here, Omnis creatura habet esse finitum, sed esse non receptum in aliquo, non est finitum, imo absolutum. Ergo, omnis creatura habet esse receptum in aliquo, et ita oportet quod habeat duo ad minus scilicet esse, et id quod esse recipit. The minor states that every creature has a finite, that is limited being, esse. It seems that for Thomas it is self-evident that every creature is finite. And if a creature is finite, then its respective being cannot be infinite but must also be finite. Furthermore, Thomas often argues that there can only be one subsistent being itself, esse ipsum subsistens, that is, a being ends that is infinite being itself, esse. He often holds this on grounds of some form of what has later been called the principle of identity of indiscernibles. For according to Aquinas, infinite being includes all perfections of being. However, if there were another infinite being, it would necessarily have to include all perfections of being, which would mean that the latter infinite being would be indistinguishable from the former, and thus really identical to it. So he has also some other arguments which I actually think are stronger than that, but yeah, so there are at least texts where he argues like that. So therefore, Thomas concludes, every other being apart from this unique subsistent being, that is infinite being itself, God, must have limited being. It is noteworthy that the minor, and thus also this whole argument for the real distinction, holds without having already proven the existence of God, subsistent being itself. Indeed, we already said that for Thomas Aquinas, it is self-evident that every creature is limited and has therefore limited being, regardless of whether there is an entity that has infinite being. For Aquinas, we do not have first to prove the existence of God in order to comprehend the truth of the minor. Furthermore, even if the epistemic value of the minor were only warranted because there can only be one infinite esse ipsum subsistens, this would still not necessitate the proof of the existence of such a being. In fact, that there can possibly only be one infinite being itself is a logical necessity and does not prove the existence of such a being. It only states that if there were such a subsistent being itself, there could only be one such infinite being itself. But the truly interesting premise providing the name to this type of argumentation for the real distinction is the major, which states that being, when it is not received in something else, that is to say, being as such, is not limited but absolute. Thomas Aquinas defends throughout his oeuvre that being as such or act as such is not limited but infinite. However, the statement of the unlimited nature of being as such implies a certain conception of being, which means that the force of the entire argument will depend on what exactly Aquinas means by being esse. For instance, if being were conceived as the existence that merely realizes an already formally constituted essence, pushing the latter, as it were, from the world of possibility into the world of reality, then the argument loses all of its demonstrative force. Being as the existence of an essence does certainly not imply by itself infinity. But such an understanding, I take it, would closely resemble the position of John of St. Thomas. And this is text 2. He says, existentia abet pro effectu formali ponerrem extra causas et extra nihil, quod est transferre de statu possibili ad statum actualem. Furthermore, it must be noted that this conception of being as mere existence implies that the essence possesses already in itself an original formal actuality not reducible to being. The essence is formally self-sufficient. It is what it is, quid sit, independently from the question of whether it exists or not, ansit. Similarly, being as mere existence concerns only the ansit and not the quid sit. A Thomist who subscribed to such a view was Thomas Thin, a Czech author who mostly wrote in Italian. Consider, for example, the following passage that defends the essence's own actuality up to the point of talking even of two original acts. Let me here read my literal translation into English in this text 3. It will then be necessary, Tin writes, to distinguish two types of act, each with its own potency, according to the principle proprius actus in propria potentia. The first will be the formal act constitutive of the essence. The other will be the entitative act, which will confer to the finite being not its being this or that thing, but its existence, sic et simpliciter. It comes as no surprise that Tin relies heavily on scholastic interpretations of Thomas Aquinas, citing in particular John of St. Thomas in support of his reading. I draw your attention to the last sentence of the quote taken from John of St. Thomas's text, which is text 4 in your handout. The last sentence says, cum ergo ratio specifica est essentialis sit per se e principaliter in ipsa natura, oportet quod existentia quae solum participative ed accessorie participat perfectionem specificam essentiae, secundum hoc imperfectio sit illa. However, to repeat, this cannot be, I take it, how Thomas Aquinas understands being as such esse, for otherwise it would make no sense for him to state, as he does not only in our passage from the sentence commentary, but throughout his oeuvre, that being in itself is unlimited. Thus, in order to understand what exactly Thomas Aquinas means by being as such, let us turn to one of the clearest passages of the Corpus Thomisticum concerning Aquinas' understanding of being. The famous De Potentia, question 7, article 2 ad nonum, which is from his Roman period. The analysis of this text will further highlight the impossibility of ascribing to Aquinas an understanding of being in terms of an existence that merely realizes an essence that is already perfect in its own formal order. It is truly noteworthy that Thomas uses 3 times the formula hoc quod dico esse, that which I call being. In contrast to the modern and contemporary proclivity for rashly claiming novelty, medieval thinkers in general, and Thomas Aquinas in particular, do usually not bluntly state what they themselves think, but typically base themselves on well-established authorities. Still, in this short passage, Thomas uses as 3 times the first person when explaining his conception of being, which indicates both the importance of this doctrine for him and his awareness of its originality. Let us analyze the passage in more detail, sentence by sentence, and this is text 5. Thomas begins by stating that what he calls being, esse, is the most perfect of all, since act is always more perfect than potency. Hoc quod dico esse est inter omnia perfectissimum, quod ex hoc patet, qui actus est semper perfectio potentia. Thus we see already that Thomas conceives of being as actuality, and that he defends the anteriority and superiority of act over potency. He goes on to say that any given form is not understood as enjoying actuality except insofar as it is held to be. Que libet autem forma signata non intelligitur in actu nisi per hoc quod esse ponitur. Here Thomas anticipates the conclusion, stating that the actuality of the form comes from its being, esse. Being as such is the source of any actuality found in a given form. To illustrate this point, Aquinas proceeds to give several examples. Thomas writes that the forms of humanity or fire can be considered as existing 1 in the potency of matter, 2 or within the power of an agent which could bring it into being, or 3 in the intellect. But it is only 4, that which has being, esse, that is rendered actually existing. Nam humanitas vel igneitas potes considerare ut 1 in potentia materia existens, vel 2 ut in virtute agentis, aut etiam 3 ut in intellecto, sed hoc quod habet esse 4 efficitur actu existens. Hence, in this part, Thomas explains that there are 2 ontological situations for a given form. Either the form is not real, being either in the potency of matter or in the virtus of an agent or in the intellect, or the form has being as such. Such a form that has being is in act, and it is so because of its being, esse. Because of this, what Thomas calls being esse is the actuality of all acts and the perfection of all perfections. Unde patet, quod hoc quod dico esse est actualitas omnium actum, et propter hoc est perfectio omnium perfectionum. This is the very core that explains how Thomas understands being as such. Every real existing act draws all of its actuality and its perfection. Thomas started by saying that the act is always more perfect than potency, from being as from its source. This is why being is the actuality of all acts and the perfection of all perfections. In other words, being as such is for Thomas not just a further perfection, but the source of whatever perfective dimension a given form has. Accordingly, Thomas states that being is actuality, actualitas. He does not say that it is an act itself, actus, for being is the source of actuality of a given act. The latter, the act, we could therefore say, is an actualized act. Thus far, Thomas has positively explained how he understands being. To further illuminate his conception, he proceeds negatively by stating what is incompatible with his particular conception of being. Let us briefly analyze this second part. Thomas explicitly rejects two different forms of understanding being as such. First, it cannot be that something else, even more formal, is added to being in such a way that it would determine and actualize being as act would a potency. Nec intelligendum est quod ei quod dico esse, aliquid datur quod sit eo formalius, ipsum determinans, sicut actus potentiam. Esse enim quod uius modo est aliud secundum essentiam ab eo cui aditur determinandum. However, this is precisely the conclusion that follows from the formalist conception of being of John of St. Thomas or Thomas Thynne we analyzed above. In fact, if the essence does not depend for its formal actuality on being, then it would formally determine and perfect being. Existence would still existentially perfect the essence, pushing it into existence, but the essence would perfect existence by specifying and determining it. Clearly, being as such is no longer understood as the source of all, also formal, perfections and actualities. Second, Thomas states that it is impossible to add to being something that falls completely outside of being as such, which, to be clear, would be non-being, nothingness. Nihil autem potest addi ad esse quod sit extranium ab ipso, cum ab eo nihil sit extranium nisi non ens, quod non potest esse nec forma nec materia. Let me briefly note that, interestingly, this is precisely the route Hegel takes at the beginning of his logic. While this conception of being is diametrically opposed to the formalist notion of being Aquinas criticizes for adding to being something more formal in such a way that being would be determined and actualized as potency would by act, the ground for it, Hegel's position, has been prepared in a certain way by the German scholastic metaphysics of the 17th century, the so-called Deutsche Schulmetaphysik, with its formalist conception of being. In fact, once being is conceived of as merely the minimal capacity to push into existence prior to and independent of any content, it is totally indeterminate. It is a nothingness that, however, is still an act. In this vein, Hegel's logic states that nothingness, nichts, becomes the truth of being as such, sein, and their passage into each other is famously becoming werden. Thus, Thomas concludes, being cannot be determined by something else as potency by act, but only as act by potency. Unde non sic determinato esse per aliud sicut potentia per actum, sed magis sicut actus per potentiam. In other words, if something is added to being, it is added as potency is added to act. We are now in position to understand why Thomas Aquinas states that being as such is in itself unlimited. This follows from the notion that being is the source of all actuality and perfection. Therefore, if every creature has limited being, it must be so because something else was added to being, thereby limiting it, and as was said and is right, also determining it, right, positively. According to the end of our passage of De Potentia, this can be neither something else more formal and more perfect than being as such, nor something outside of being, nothingness, but only something that is added to being as potency is added to act. Therefore, in order to account for the finitude of being, esse, of a certain entity, ens, the latter has to be composed of the former, esse, and something else that is added to the former, as potency is added to act. And this is precisely the essence which contracts, as it were, the infinity of being as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Christian. We'll open the floor for questions.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
This was really interesting. So I have a little bit of a worry that you haven't quite earned what I take to be the thing that you think is your kind of conclusion.
Okay.
And the reason is because I think to earn the conclusion you want, you need not just, looking at text 1, you need not just sed esse non receptum in aliquo non est finitum. You also need this. Essentia non receptum in aliquo est finitum.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't seen any texts where you've got that in Aquinas. Another way to put the worry is this, is if we take seriously Dewan's interpretation of the beginning of the De Ente, right? And we say, hey, look, essence and esse scale in parallel, right? Such that the truest esse is esse found most truly is going to be unreceived, and essence found most truly is going to be unreceived, right? I think on that vision, you don't get the conclusion that you want.
Again, so you say, I still have to prove that essentia is necessarily finite for Aquinas?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think you need to produce texts that say not just that created
Right.
essence.
Okay.
Or something
Yeah.
like that. You need
Okay.
that,
Yeah.
that esse considered absolute
Understood.
is infinite, but essence considered absolute is finite. And I'm worried you're not going to find those
Yeah.
texts. In Aquinas.
No, I certainly won't find them. But I would push back on your premise insofar as I think if you take or if you accept that esse by itself is unlimited, right? Then the argument is you cannot the same principle that in itself is infinite cannot by itself be that which makes it finite, right? So the only thing is in order to account for the finitude, you need a second principle, right? Which not necessarily I have to show that principle is finite in itself, right? But at least it accounts for the finitude of the real composition. And I think those texts, there are several texts where you can show that essence in a real composite is that which accounts for the finitude, right? We can talk on that. For example, I didn't go into that. That's the last text. They're very literal. He says, S is contracted by essence, right? But but thank you for. Yeah.
I'd like to respond to this to add something. I think finite is not an absolute property. It consists in a relation of it has to do with infer, to limiting. So the question is, what is limiting by what?
Mm-hmm.
And the essence as such, you cannot say that essence is limited or finite. But the question is whether being esse is made finite,
Right.
limited.
Yeah.
And esse as such is not
Right.
limited.
It's a
But
principle, right?
Simple,
Now we would.
Look at the words you are pronounced. If I say being, just simple being is not limited by something. Now, being is without limits. If I say being a horse, that is being limited by the fact that it's being a horse. You understand?
Yes.
And not being a table.
Sure.
Then it's being limited by the addition of an horse.
Yes, yes. Yeah, maybe two things to that. Like one, yes, I think it is important, as you point out, like we're talking about co-principles of entities, right? And not, like, if not, we are talking about real distinctions of two really existing things, right? Which, yeah, we as Thomas, we wouldn't like to defend that, right? But secondly, and that's, I didn't go into here now, the worry is like, okay, yeah, Thomas is just, it's not limited as a notional concept, right? So here he is just talking about being as a notion, right? And sometimes the examples he gives don't really help because, like, he speaks his famous example about whiteness, right? That in itself is just infinite, and then that white thing is particular. So one could think, oh well, he's just using here being as that which, as whiteness is by itself infinite, right? But I think the hard part of the argument is not so much to understand that act itself or being itself is by itself unlimited. Like that, it's easier to grasp, let's say. The harder part is to see in an entity, like in a real being, to find that actus essendi, let's say, and see that by itself it is, yeah, a principle, a source of actuality that by itself, in its own order, is unlimited, right? So there, it's no longer any like a notional principle, but it's actually a real, yeah, ontological principle. But
We have time for one more question, maybe in back.
Yeah. I've had a question kind of based off of David Bentley Hart's kind of modal view of being, and how you might use the real distinction to kind of address the observations that he makes, that all things that exist by dint of participating or receiving being, and thus there is nothing that exists that is distinct from being in some sense. And the conclusion he draws is that all things differ modally. That's when he comes to "you are gods," where he has a somewhat Spinozist view of existence. How would a Thomist respond to that through the real distinction?
yeah, well, I think you hear a lot more knowledge of people that could respond to that. But certainly Thomas is not a pantheist, which I take like David is maybe, okay, this is recorded, there is like going into that direction, or there are readings that could go into that direction, let's say, right? So you could say by the classic analogy entis, right? So the distance between finite being and infinite being is just, it's an infinite distance, right? So a finite being, even like participating, even if you talk participation language, there's still an infinite distance, so that we are not like little parts of God, or yeah. But that's like just a start of an answer. But yeah.
Actually, do have a moment for maybe one more quick question if somebody has one.
So, yeah, sure.
That's my worry
Yes.
for myself even.
Yes.
Sometimes I'm getting comfortable the idea that potency is a limitation.
Right.
But the text, in certain sense, the last text
Right.
is that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I liked what you said. Like, yeah, it's a limitation on one part, but for us, like, a limitation, it's a positive determination, right?
Okay.
And which allows for like that. Yeah, I have many thoughts on that. Like also virtus essendi and potentia essendi and so on. I read it more with act of being and not so much on essence, but
Okay.
which allows then for the act of being to further have new perfections, right? Yeah. But yeah, you're right that for so many times it has like Gilson's position also. It in order, since it's polemical, right? It reads polemically. the danger is that it pushes or it says that essence is purely negative, right? And you would want to avoid that, yeah.
Thank you very much, Father Christian.
Father Matthews, I don't know, I'm sorry, people, that there's a handout of mine there. It's in the end. It was my confusion. It was prepared. It's in the end of the class. So if someone wants to take in the end, it's there, the texts.
So, last but not least, I'm glad to welcome Michael Bishop, who is a graduate student in philosophy at the Catholic University of America and received his BA at Thomas Aquinas College in California. His research focuses on Thomistic metaphysics and the philosophy of nature. The title of his presentation is Participation in Aquinas' An Exposition of the Hebdomads of Boethius, a critique of Daniel de Haan's interpretation of the second mode of participation.
In Aquinas' commentary on Boethius' De Hebdomadibus, he provides, rather briefly, a threefold account of participation, and one scholar, Daniel de Haan, in his article Actus essendi and the second mode of participation, attempts to give a principled account of each mode, with a particular focus on the second mode. I intend to explain and critique de Haan's account of the three modes, and then provide a more precise account that is closely grounded in Aquinas' commentary. In his commentary, Aquinas introduces the term participare, saying that it is as if to take a part. And then he proposes a threefold division of participation. And this is given in texts 1, 2, and 3 on the handout. So the first mode, quote, "And therefore, when something receives particularly that which belongs to another universally, it is said to participate in that, just as man is said to participate in animal, because it does not have the account of animal according to its total commonality. For the same reason, Socrates participates in man," unquote. And the second mode, quote, "Similarly, a subject participates in an accident, and matter in form, because a substantial form, or an accidental one, which according to its own account is common, is determined to this or that subject," unquote. And finally, the third mode, quote, "And similarly, an effect too is said to participate in its cause, and chiefly when it is not equal to the power of its cause. For example, if we should say that the air participates in the light of the sun because it does not receive that light with the brilliance it has in the sun," unquote. De Haan wants to provide a principled account of each mode based on what Aquinas says here. However, he also believes that all that Aquinas explicitly provides are examples that are themselves insufficient to produce such an account. As a result, rather than provide a careful textual exegesis, de Haan proposes an account checking if it fits with the examples and holds up against a number of objections. De Haan posits, like other scholars, that the first mode is concerned with logical or merely conceptual participation, as opposed to the latter two modes, which are ontological. About the latter two modes, de Haan writes, quote, "The second mode concerns ontological modes of participation that essentially involve potency-act participation, whereas effect-cause participation is proprietary to the third mode," unquote. De Haan concludes, and as I see it, rightfully so, that his account does accommodate all of the examples that Aquinas gives. De Haan also points out that, on his reading, participation of ends in esse would be an instance of the second mode, something that he finds desirable. The objections de Haan raises against himself all aim to show that according to his account, the modes will be insufficiently distinct from one another. The first objection argues that the third mode, namely effect-cause participation, would include in it the second mode, namely potency-act participation. Form stands to its matter as act stands to potency. Yet at the same time, form and matter are causes. Thus, instances of the second mode are also instances of the third mode. In response to this hypothetical objection, de Haan argues that material and formal causes are causes of the composite rather than of their co-principle. If de Haan is right about this, then the objection fails. Matter does not cause form, and neither does form cause matter. Instead, they each cause the composite. Therefore, matter would only participate in form according to the second mode, namely potency-act participation, and not the third mode, namely effect-cause participation. To Haan's response suffices if he is right about the relationship of form to matter. However, there is some reason to be cautious concerning this interpretation. De Haan himself concedes in a footnote that Aquinas will at times say that form causes matter, and matter causes form. De Haan interprets Aquinas to be speaking loosely in such cases, but this seems questionable. For example, in De Principiis Naturae, Aquinas uses material and formal causes, specifically body and soul, to show how causes can be reciprocal causes of one another in different respects. As formal cause and material cause are explained in this text, they could not be taken as causes of the composite. Indeed, Aquinas goes on to explicitly explain how matter and form are causes of one another, not bringing up the composite here at all, and saying, and this is text 4 on your handout, quote, "Indeed, matter is said to be the cause to form insofar as form does not exist except in matter. And similarly, form is the cause to matter insofar as matter does not have esse and act except through form," unquote. It does not seem from this text that Aquinas is speaking loosely, but rather drawing attention to this fact in a deliberate manner. More should be said on this topic before it is decisive, but presently it is enough to make one a little more wary of De Haan's account of the three modes. If form does cause matter, and matter does cause form, then De Haan must explain why matter's relation to form would not be a case of both the second and the third mode. The next objection likewise argues that on De Haan's account, the modes would be insufficiently distinct. This time, the objection argues that the second mode, namely potency-act participation, would contain the third mode, namely effect-cause participation. De Haan grounds this objection on what Aquinas asserts in the Summa Contra Gentilis, and this is text 5 on your handout. There Aquinas writes, quote, "Every participating thing is compared to that which is participated as potency to act," unquote. In other words, all instances of participation involve the potency-act relationship, not only the second mode. If this is right, then the first and third mode would in fact be instances of the second mode, and thus not adequately distinct from it. De Haan does not provide a decisive refutation of this argument, but instead looks to the order of knowing as an indication that they would yet be sufficiently distinct. And while I agree that this would show some distinction between the modes, I still hold that this text from the Summa Contra Gentilis presents some serious problem to De Haan's account. It is not enough to show that there is some distinction between the modes, but they must be properly distinguished. If, by analogy, one were to distinguish triangles from quadrilaterals by saying that triangles are three-sided rectilinear figures, whereas quadrilaterals are figures with straight sides, one would have made a distinction, but such a distinction would only show that the one is a more specific case of the other. That is, a triangle is just a certain kind of figure with straight sides. This is not how quadrilaterals and triangles are distinct, however. Rather, triangle and quadrilateral are both rectilinear figures, and they differ according to the number of sides they have. If the potency-act relationship extends beyond the second mode, then the three modes are not relevantly nor sufficiently distinct. Thus, if De Haan's account is to stand, then one would need to provide some reason why what seems to be said universally in the Summa Contra Gentilis, namely, that every participating thing is to participated thing as potency is to act, does not apply to every mode given in Aquinas' commentary on Boethius' De Hebdomadibus. If this is not done, then De Haan's account would have the second mode include both the first and the third, making it clear that De Haan's account is lacking. I believe that the main way in which De Haan could respond to this difficulty is by showing that some sort of equivocation takes place, such that the claim that participation involves the potency-act relationship applies only to the second mode. I give a more in-depth consideration of this possibility in my full paper, but for the sake of time, I will simply say this. One should not seek for equivocations unless there is some good reason to do so. If Aquinas seemed to contradict himself, for example. When Aquinas claims that every participating is to participated as potency is to act, there is reason to think that Aquinas was only speaking about ontological sorts of participation, since in these places he is always concerned with ontological implications. But what is still said seems to apply to the second and third mode, since both are ontological. For De Haan's account to stand, one would still need to show that what is said applies only to the second mode. The only present reason, however, to hold this view seems to be to save de Haan's account. Remember, de Haan's proposal is not closely grounded in the text, as he himself admits. Indeed, Aquinas nowhere says that the second mode is potency act participation. And thus, Aquinas does not appear to contradict himself, but rather, he disagrees with de Haan. De Haan claims that the potency act relationship is the feature that distinguishes the second mode from the third mode, but Aquinas seems to apply the potency act relationship to the second and the third mode. Indeed, Aquinas does not even mention the potency act relationship when explaining any of the three modes in his commentary. In summary of what has been said so far, we can say the following. De Haan proposed that the first mode is logical participation, the second mode is ontological potency act participation, and the third mode is ontological effect-cause participation. By examining the objections, we have seen some reason to think that the effect-cause relationship would also include members of the potency-act relationship, namely in the case of formal causality. And we've also seen that Aquinas himself seems to apply the potency-act relationship not only to the second mode of participation, but to all ontological cases of participation. Thus, de Haan's account fails to adequately distinguish the three modes. Given that de Haan's account is not closely grounded in Aquinas' commentary, we thus return to the commentary in search of an alternative account. In treating the first mode, and again, this is text 1 on the handout, Aquinas says, quote, "And therefore, when something receives particularly that which belongs to the universally, it is said to participate in that, just as man is said to participate in animal, because it does not have the account of animal according to its total commonality. For the same reason, Socrates participates in man," unquote. Or, stated more generically, when this happens, it is said to participate, just as in this example, because of this reason, and likewise in this example. As should be clear in this generic restatement of what Aquinas says, there is more here than mere example. Indeed, the reason that Aquinas gives appears to be a sufficient account of the first mode. The first mode is when the first mode participant possesses the account of the participated, but without the same degree of commonality. It is therefore not wrong to refer to this mode as a logical relation, as de Haan and others do, but it is better to say that the proper account is when one participates in something with a greater or more generic account. Conversely, the account of one will be a more specific version of the other. For example, the account of man includes not just animal, but rational as well. This account of the first mode does not ultimately differ substantially from de Haan's, but we see here that it is almost directly from Aquinas' commentary. Concerning the second mode, Aquinas writes, and again this is text 2, quote, "A subject participates in an accident, in matter, in form, because a substantial form, or an accidental one, which according to its own account is common, is determined to this or that subject," unquote. Again, generically, this participates in that because of this reason. Once again, this generic restatement shows that Aquinas provides a reason beyond the examples. The reason given is that something that is intelligibly common is limited to a subject, that is, as I understand it, a single finite existence. Note here that unlike the first mode, a subject, that is a single extramental existent, must come about from this mode of participation. We have thus moved to an ontological rather than a logical relationship. Although Aquinas speaks here of a principle with a more universal, intelligible content, it is still the case that this principle comes to exist in a subject, and thus this mode involves participation in an ontological principle rather than a merely logical entity. And I should say, I don't mean to suggest here that that limited ontological principle will remain universal. It's still determined to that single subject, but in its account, it is potentially intelligible as universal. So this mode of participation would necessarily involve a potency-act relationship, as de Haan says, but it is more relevant and precise and grounded in the text of Aquinas to say that this mode of participation is a participation in a potentially intelligible principle by determining it to a single existence. Lastly, concerning the third mode, and again this is text 3, Aquinas writes, quote, "And similarly, an effect too is said to participate in its cause, and chiefly when it is not equal to the power of its cause. For example, if we should say that air participates in the light of the sun because it does not receive that light with the brilliance it has in the sun, unquote. Stated generically, this participates in that, chiefly in this case. For example, like this, because of this reason. Again, there's more here than the mere example, but also further explanation. Aquinas' explanation shows that the third mode chiefly involves reception and formal similitude. It thus seems that the third mode of participation would apply straightforwardly only to equivocal, efficient causality, since only in this kind of causality are those two features straightforwardly present. One might object to this reading, since it fails to map the third mode, or the other modes, onto the four kinds of causality, namely formal, final, material, and efficient. But there is no compelling reason to expect that the modes of participation should account for all forms of causality. The only indication that the third mode should directly map to any sort of causality is that Aquinas begins by saying an effect participates in its cause. But this alone does not seem to establish the need to account for every kind of causality. Given that Aquinas' explanation does not seem to square with anything beyond equivocal, efficient causality, then it is reasonable to leave it restricted to that one kind of causality. Perhaps one could show how other forms of causality belong in the third mode, but doing so should not come at the expense of losing reception and similitude as the key elements that identify the third mode. Given this new interpretation of each of the three modes, it can be shown how they relate to one another. Effects participate in their cause, according to the third mode, insofar as they have received some similitude from the cause. Such a similitude is, in itself, in account, a universal principle that is determined to a subject. In other words, the received similitude is itself participated in by the matter or subject according to the second mode. Finally, this received similitude can be understood according to a more or less common concept. Thus, the first mode of participation will arise when a subject is understood by means of more or less universal concepts of the received similitude. The concepts themselves can then participate in more common concepts, or be participated in by less common concepts. So then if we go through that outline, but with an example, we say, for example, the sun causes the illumination of the air by producing in it a lesser light. The air thus participates in the sun according to the third mode, insofar as the lesser light is a similitude of the sun's light and is received from the sun. The air also participates in the lesser light according to the second mode, insofar as the subject, namely air, determines the form of the lesser light, which is in its account common, to itself. The matter of Socrates participates in the form man also according to the second mode, insofar as the form man, which is in its account common, is determined to Socrates. If someone understands, however, that Socrates is a man, Socrates is said to participate in the concept man in the first mode. The concept man can then further be said to participate in animal, insofar as animal is a more universal or generic concept than man. Thus, Haan was right to look for a principled account of participation, and his account provides occasion for a careful consideration of the text. By returning more carefully to the text, we see that Aquinas provides more than an enumeration of examples. Through Aquinas' explanation of these examples, he gives a principled account of the three modes of participation. I have attempted to articulate what I understand to be Aquinas' account and show where Haan's interpretation falls short, most significantly concerning the second mode. Although this mode must involve a potency-act relationship, the more proper account is that the second mode of participation is when a less universal principle determines a more universal principle to a single finite existence. A further investigation of Aquinas' use of the term participation throughout his corpus would help further corroborate or perhaps refute my reading, but for the time we have arrived at a principled account of participation that is explicitly grounded in the text of Aquinas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop. We'll open the floor again for some questions. Father Philip.
Yeah, great.
3 for 3.
So comment on the question. The comment is just this, and I mean this is unfair because he didn't do it in print, but Daniel has cried uncle and admits that what he should have said in the paper is act potency composition relations. And so one thing that might be interesting for you to explore is just, if you add the composition in there, how does that relate to your proposal of determination? Because plausibly, those might end up being both existentially and intentionally equivalent. The question is just this. I just missed this during your talk. So you have it classed under text 1, the first mode, but do you take quando aliquid particulariter recipit id quod ad alterum pertinet universaliter dicitor participare illud to be a general ratio of participation that applies to all 3 or 4 modes in the text? Or do you take that to be the specific ratio of the first mode?
Yeah, that one, as I see it now, I think it's part of the first mode specifically. And the reason I think that is because a little bit later in the De Hebdomadibus, Aquinas argues that that the first mode and the second mode, in neither of those modes could something be said to participate in esse. Wait, sorry.
Could esse be said?
Yeah, you could esse. Yeah. So, and then there he appears to identify the first mode by saying that phrase, that when something receives particularly that which belongs to him universally, he seems to use that to identify the first mode, which I don't think is the most compelling reason, and it seems there's a large part of him that wants to read that more generically, but with the way he uses it later, it seems like he's using that to identify the first mode, so I left it there. Yeah.
May I ask a follow-up question about that same statement? So I'm a sometime RO theologian, radical orthodoxy theologian, and so I'd be strongly inclined to view that phrase as applying more generally or ontologically, because it would seem to me that creatures receive particularly what belongs to God universally, namely measure of being, participation in being. So I'm just wondering how, more generally, how do these map on to the kind of God-world relation?
Yeah. So I think. Yeah. Again, I'm not wholly opposed to treating that first part more generically. Just based on that later part in the De Hebdomadibus, that's why I put it in the first mode. But yeah, you're right. As it's stated, it does seem to be fairly generally applicable. The way I understood the relation to God, and I'm a little hesitant about this based on some of the things that Dr. Dewan has said, but it seems to me that you would say that creatures participate in God according to that third mode, so namely as effects, and they're doing that by receiving a similitude of God. So is that, do you want me to say more about that, or that's kind of generically how I'm seeing the picture?
Right, so you would kind of map on, the God-world relation would most properly belong to that third.
Yeah, I think so.
Mode.
I think so. Yes.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. I start with a question. You mentioned in your talk fourth mode of participation, according to the participation of ens in esse.
Yeah.
According to Haan, he tried to reduce the fourth mode to the second mode here. So it is case of subject and form, or subject and accident, of how to call it. I don't think that is true. But what is your own opinion? I think I missed that.
Yeah, I didn't explicitly say how I thought about that, though I think ultimately I would agree with Haan actually that ens participating in esse would just fall into the second mode, based on.
That's not true. That's impossible.
Why do you say that?
Esse is not limited by receiving esse. And that's the point of the text 2, the second mode. It is determined to this of that subject. But if esse is received or participated by ens has the same universality as esse. So there's no question of determination or limitation.
So just to clarify, are you saying that ens isn't limited or that esse isn't limited?
No, they both not limited. Ens, as such, the term ens is strictly universal, have the same universality as esse. Esse is not received in concrete subject or in a concrete being, but there is just a relation between being, ens, the concrete form, and esse, the abstract form. But they don't differ in universality.
Yeah, I guess, would it make you more comfortable if I had said ens participates in actus essendi according to the second mode?
Or just to say.
Because it seems to me that, wouldn't you say that, and perhaps I'm just misunderstanding this, but that the actus essendi of an individual subject, like if you're considering how it exists currently, it has to be more limited insofar as that's not the whole of being. That, you know, my being is human being, it's not dog being. So it seems that there is something restricted, right? So I guess that's what I'm thinking. Insofar as esse or actus essendi is a principle of my being, it seems that it's limited, at least according to its account, insofar as.
But that is not what Thomas is talking about in the text.
With the ens esse, you're saying?
No, he simply says, without much explanation. There's also always the problem with Thomas. He doesn't give enough explanation.
That's why we're here 800 years later.
Yeah, but he simply says, there is a difference between the concrete and abstract.
Yeah.
Being ens is concrete and the abstract is esse. So you can call the relation between the concrete and abstract as in the case of participation. The concrete participates in abstract, the ens participate in the actus essendi. But he doesn't say anything more about it. That is so frustrating.
I agree, it's frustrating, yeah. Wait, are you going to help me out, Father, or make this worse?
I don't know. Maybe play peacemaker. You know, so,
Okay.
so I think one thing that that might help kind of zero in on the point that Professor Tevelde is making is something that I take it, given your earlier answer, you're familiar with, right? So it's really striking that when in that precise passage in the De Hebdomads commentary, when Aquinas shifts from talking about the common conceptions of the soul that pertain to ens to the common conceptions of the soul that pertain to unum, he says, in all of the common conceptions of the soul that we just talked about pertaining to ens, we were speaking only according to intentione, right? And now when we're talking about unum, right, that like, when he says that that's where you get things like real distinction, right? So there you're talking of secundum rem, not secundum intentionem. So I think what Professor Tevelde is a little bit worried about is it sounds like you're trying to pack in the real considerations that are ontological into the explanation of the ens participates esse claim that's appearing in a part of the text where Aquinas says explicitly he's only talking about the intentiones.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think I agree. But my main point would be, I think you're looking for more than the text contains. What Aquinas does in the text is rather simple, but you are making a heavy systematic theory of it. The only thing he does is, what is participation? Now let us give a kind of description of a general definition of participation. And then he mentioned three different contexts in which you can use the term participation, but in different ways, in different senses. That's all he does. He points at three different contexts. And without making that a heavy metaphysical theory of it.
I guess, yeah, maybe I'm not trying to make it heavy, I suppose. I mean, I can see how maybe, yeah, it does maybe seem like I'm doing more than there is here to be done with. But at least it just seems that if you're even trying to get a sense of what are these senses he's talking about, I think there could be more, at least when I was reading Haan and some others on this, it just seemed like there was a reduction to all he's doing is just providing examples, and like it'd be useful if we could distinguish the senses of each of these that he's talking about. And it seems that they were hoping that the examples just by themselves could do that. And I guess my only intent was to show that, look, there's a little more than examples, maybe not a robust kind of systematic treatment of it, but there is seemingly some explanation that would better divide these different senses. And I think specifically with the case of Haan, I mean, I think it makes more sense to talk about determination there to a subject rather than to be talking about potency act, when that's not even something he brings up in that second mode. So I think generally, I think that's, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, you're right. But that's the same problem. Active potency do not play a role in this text. And the Summa Cum Gentiles text, it sounds like a universal principle, that Aquinas is formulating a universal principle true in every cases and everywhere. Every participating thing is compared to that which is participated as potency to act. That's the problem with Aquinas. He's always formulating universal propositions.
Sure.
But they are not necessarily universal, they are contextual. In this context, it is important to introduce the notion potency and act. And he used that in this context. But it's not necessarily valid in every other context. But he seems to suggest that.
Yeah.
And that's why reading Aquinas is so difficult, because he always suggesting that something has a deeper sense, or that something is more, or that something is has a kind of mathematical axioma to be applied everywhere. But I think that Aquinas is more a contextual thinker.
Sure.
Yeah.
On that note, I'm afraid we're out of time. I realize there are a couple of other questions here, but maybe we can bring those to the speakers afterwards. Our own context is coffee time, so let's wrap up.